We're going to begin our afternoon with a short presentation focused on geospatial technologies for risk modeling and monitoring, with a spotlight presentation by Dr. Richard Hewston entitled The Role of Geospatial Data in Managing Interconnected Climate and Environmental, Social, and Governance Risks. Dr. Hewston.
Thank you. Also, thank you for not scheduling me on the lightning talks. Those seem quite intimidating. Apologies for interrupting your lunch. I'll try and make this brief. Just to ease into the afternoon, I wanted to start with a quote. So, climatology is a peculiarly applied science in that its raison d'etre is its relation to human welfare. You have to find out those things about climate that mean something to somebody. Now, a changing climate will mean different things to different people. But there's no doubt that all communities, all businesses, all investors will be affected in some shape or form, whether it's through the physical impacts or whether it's related to the transition to a low-carbon economy. And the thing that I want you to take away from this presentation is that we can't think about climate as a closed system. In order to make informed decisions, we have to think about how it relates to society, to politics, to economies. And we've heard a lot in the last day or so about climate change and the different risks that it poses. But given the nature of the world, we know that climate-related events have direct and indirect impacts, and those cascade through financial systems, ecosystems. We heard yesterday about the impacts on food chains and supply chains. The severity of these impacts and the speed at which they occur will vary over space and time. So that means we need to be thinking about resilience decisions, whether that's related to finance, policy, or infrastructure. We need to be thinking about them while being cognizant of all these other interconnected issues. So what makes climate risk so complex? Well, to start with, there's a huge amount of scrutiny on how organizations are managing and disclosing their climate risk management practices at the moment. There's a whole plethora of climate-related risk disclosure legislation across different jurisdictions. You see it in the EU, Japan, New Zealand, and most recently in California. But essentially, they're all designed to ensure that companies are managing the most material climate risks that they face. And these risks can manifest in different ways, and I've got a list on the right-hand side there. I'm not going to go through them. This list is definitely not exhaustive. But returning to that original quote, we know there's still some unknowns in there, but we've got a pretty good handle on those things about climate that mean something to somebody. So how can we go about making those informed decisions? Well, that's where my company, Verisk Maplecroft, comes in. We're a global risk intelligence business, and we're part of the wider Verisk family of companies. You heard from my colleagues, Todd Barr and Roger Grenier yesterday. We work with businesses, governments, and NGOs to help them make more informed, risk-adjusted decisions by providing unique, interconnected view of global risk centered around environment, human rights, and political risks. So how do we do it? Well, it's no surprise, given the nature of this conference. At our core, we have a set of geospatial risk analytics that draws on a range of sources. So we use satellite imagery, we use unstructured data, we rely on climate models, as well as other environmental models. And we employ a range of different technologies and methodologies that pull all this together into decision-useful geospatial data sets. And we cover over 150 different risk issues across those 5 broad buckets of risk that you can see there: natural capital, climate change, human rights, political risk, and economics. Specifically to climate, this is an area that we've been providing risk data for about 15, 20 years now. And during that time, we've worked with companies from pretty much every sector. We've worked with financial institutions, we've worked with government agencies, we've worked with supranational bodies like the UN. But in the last 10 years or so, our focus has very much been around helping businesses understand the intersection of and the dynamics between different types of climate risk. So understanding the difference between, understanding the connections between physical risk and transition risk, and how that intersects with societal systems, and more broadly, how that all relates to interconnected risks like geopolitical risk, conflict, energy security, and potential impacts on nature as well. So recently we launched a new physical risk data set. Within this, we're looking at 15 acute and chronic risks over 3 scenarios, 7 timeframes, and we have data that covers the entire globe. So it really provides a view of how these risks, so things like extreme temperatures, extreme rainfall, heat waves, sea level rise, how those risks evolve over time and how they might manifest differently in different scenarios. And the way that organizations use this is within a scenario analysis framework. So this helps with strategic decision making by factoring in some of the uncertainty that's inherent in climate modeling itself. So I've just got a few slides to run through now, providing examples of how organizations are using this data. So the map you can see on the screen is our Climate Hazards Risk Index for 2050. It's actually under a middle-of-the-road scenario, so ignore the title of the map. It should read SSP 2 4.5. But effectively, it's a composite risk index. There's a number of different indicators that go into it that capture extreme climate hazards. It captures climate variability and long-term shifts in climate. So it's very much a tool, if you like, to consider physical climate risk. And what we've done here is overlay that index with population projections. And what you can see is that some of the fastest growing megacities will be those that are exposed to some of the greatest physical climate risks. So as we heard yesterday, when we're thinking about urban planning, for example, and anticipating how services and infrastructure will keep up with that population growth, then at the same time, we need to factor in how those physical impacts of climate change will evolve. Now, when it comes to decision making, that map on the previous slide is useful, but you really need to dig into some of the underpinning data and identify, what's driving that risk, how are they connected with other risk issues. So, for example, here we're looking at hot days in the US. Hopefully, the image is moving, cycling through time. But again, it's similar to the conversations that we were hearing yesterday. It's important that we think about these projections of hot days in conjunction with future population demographics and susceptibility to extreme heat, or the potential impact on crops and food supply, or indeed the potential impact on power grid infrastructure due to increased cooling demand, or in fact, all 3 of those things, and probably a number of other factors as well. So as I mentioned earlier, we also work with investors, and they're using similar information to inform capital allocation decisions. So this is an example of one of the solutions we're providing, which delivers industry-specific insight into the exposure of a company's location, so its head office, its manufacturing facilities, its data center. And because we cover a range of risk issues, we can really paint a picture of the material risks that company's facing. So, for instance, water stress at water-intensive manufacturing facilities, or heat stress where they have operations outside, or exposure to modern slavery or child labor risks, or locations where there's civil unrest and potential political instability. So what that means in practice is that from an equities perspective, you can use the geospatial data sets to build a risk profile for each individual company in your portfolio and use that information to take appropriate actions. And that might be engagement with that company, understanding how they're managing those risks, or it might be pivoting away from that position and reducing your exposure. We can also use that climate data to consider different policy implications. So there's a lot going on in this graph, and apologies to those at the back where I was sat this morning, because I'm sure you can't see all the detail. But essentially what it's showing is physical risk on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis you have per capita emissions from energy use. And there's 3 data points for each country, representing the per capita emissions and physical risk under 3 different scenarios. So the current policy trajectory is on the left, a delayed transition is the middle data point, and then on the right, it's a below 2 degree scenario. So there's a couple of takeaways from this graph. The first shouldn't be surprising. If we decarbonize, physical risk is mitigated to some extent. But if you think about those physical risk benefits from decarbonization, what you can see is that essentially the distance between the first data point and the last data point is the benefit of decarbonization in terms of physical risk. So the longer the line, the greater the benefit, and that varies between countries. So you can see relatively short lines for Brazil and India on the left there, and relatively longer lines for the US and China, for example. But at the same time, if you perceive that as a benefit, then you might consider the cost being related to the vertical axis, so the cost of decarbonizing your energy sector. So what you see here is actually a real benefit from an orderly transition versus a delayed transition. In other words, the drop-off between the first point and the third data point for each country is less than the drop-off between the first data point and the second data point. And these are the sorts of insights that sovereign investors use our data for, so trying to unpack the implications of domestic and global policy decisions and the dynamic interplay of physical and transition risk. So hopefully that's given you a flavor of the types of solutions that we're working on and how our clients use them to inform decision-making. But I'll leave you with this quote again, because fundamentally all the solutions that we build start with finding out about those things about climate that mean something to somebody. Thank you.